Just wanted to make a few notes about my 89 Troopers vacuum diagram. I don't edit my videos, so sorry for any mispronunciations. But starting with the air injection pump. So you got this hose coming from the common chamber, meaning it has vacuum as long as the engine does. Comes around to this switch here, which is controlled by the module. Where's the one? Okay, so here's your common chamber vacuum, and I believe this one, I'm not 100% sure, but one of these, when the module switches, it gives vacuum to this diaphragm down here. I can't even get a view of it. Yeah, this diaphragm here. And when it's switched the other way, there's actually positive pressure coming into one of them to prevent it from going on when it's not supposed to. Positive pressure obviously probably comes from the pump. When the car is started, when it's cold, the module it switches so that this diaphragm has vacuum, and it pumps air into the rail for about 30 seconds or a minute. That was originally to help the catalytic converter get warmed up and start doing what it's supposed to do. I'm guessing with new catalytic converters that's not necessary anymore. As a matter of fact, the air pump is not necessary at all, which is kind of weird. California makes you keep your air pump, even though it's in a way worse for the environment because it's not necessary for the cat anymore, but it takes a little power and a little fuel for running it. So I don't know, it's kind of bizarre how they make you keep it on there, but you have to. Possibly it still helps a little bit, I don't know. But in any case, I did run this vacuum gauge in with this long tube, and I drove around with the T connected in line with the pump, because I wanted to see when is this thing actually on. So it's on for the 30 seconds or 1 minute or something when it's cold in the morning, and when you're driving it comes on for maybe 2 or 3 seconds when you come off of idle and you start accelerating, and then it shuts off. When you're on the freeway, it's just sitting there spinning, spitting all the air out through this little muffler here. I don't think it takes much power. I've read about it a little bit. I've heard maybe 1 horsepower, 2 horsepower. I don't know. Depends what RPM you're at. But it does very little. I'd say 99.9% of the time you're running the car is just spitting air out through this muffler. But here in California, you still got to have it. Onto here, that little... there's no way I'll be able to show you, but there's a little blue valve down there, and basically that has to do with your EGR. When you start the car and it's cold, if the EGR valve was operational, you'd probably get some stuttering when you go to accelerate. So that it's like a vacuum thermal valve. Maybe you can get down there to see it. Yeah, there it is. That blue piece down there. Well, I bypassed mine. I bypassed mine because it quit working, and when I bypassed it, I haven't felt any problem whatsoever. So I'm just leaving it off. Otherwise, it's ported vacuum to the EGR valve, meaning no vacuum on idle, but once you come off of idle, you have vacuum. And here is the throttle body. So here's where the ported vacuum comes from, these tubes down here. And I don't know if you can see it, but down in there are some little pinholes right by where you would open when you accelerate. You can see it, yeah. That's where the ported vacuum comes from. But the other thing I wanted to mention was this junction down here, having to do with this fuel pressure regulator. There's a vacuum hose coming out of it, and all this mess here just serves one purpose. when it's cold, again, when it's cold and you fire it up, you don't want this to have vacuum at all when you're idling, because when it doesn't have vacuum, you're at 41 psi. When it does, you're at 32, something like that, 31 or 32. And the whole point is, when you're idling, say it's warmed up, when you're idling and you have vacuum, you're running at your 31, and when you go to accelerate, you lose vacuum, so then it allows the fuel pressure to shoot up to 42. In a way, it acts like an accelerator pump and a carburetor. But when the engine's cold, you don't want there to be any vacuum when you're idling. Acts kind of like a choke, I guess, that way. That's basically what this is doing. This electric switch down here is controlled by the module, and it's basically switching it to ported vacuum while it's cold. And I did the same thing. I put a vacuum gauge on this. If you watch for a while, you'll see zero vacuum, and then after running it for a few minutes, when you see it gets some heat, suddenly you'll see vacuum. So it will have vacuum on idle. That's what this is for. And if you think you have it hooked up wrong, that's what you should do, is hook up a vacuum gauge here and run it for a while and see if it's on idle. If it's at zero, when you open the throttle a little bit, you should see you do have a little vacuum when you open the throttle. Then once it warms up, you should always have vacuum on it. And of course, unless you go to wide open throttle, then you wouldn't have any for a bit. The canister back here, the charcoal canister, I definitely have mine plugged in. It's in use, but I don't know if it's working. I don't know if the charcoal's old. I don't know if I ought to replace it. I do know that I've read somewhere that it's all about mileage with this. The difference of with or without it is about 1 mile to the gallon. But I don't know where to find one. I'd have to cut this open and replace the charcoal, so I'm not going to bother with any of that. Is there anything else I ought to say about this? I think that covers most of the quirks. One other thing to mention, this is not vacuum related, but I had to replace my master cylinder. And the only reason I knew that is because when I would jack the car up and spin the wheels, once in a while the brakes would be holding on in the front. They'd be dragging really bad. It would take a lot of my effort to move the wheel. And that's probably what was making a lot of the difference on the hills. Sometimes I'd go up the hills pretty fast and sometimes I wouldn't. So on these older vehicles, I would suggest jacking up the car and making sure all the wheels spin freely sometimes. Had to replace the master cylinder, and I also had to replace the caliper back there. I ended up replacing all the calipers, but I think it was an emergency brake problem and it was dragging. The cable was also tight, but that's a totally different thing. It was rusted inside. I had to free that up. But anyway, I probably left a few things out, but this is probably the last video I'll do on this for a while, unless anyone has any specific questions. So I hope I was of some help to some. I've definitely seen some videos on YouTube that helped me a lot, and I appreciate that. So let me know if there's any questions.